We have a lot to get through today. One thing you will find is that architects tend to talk fast. So we're going to try to cram a lot into the next 20, 25 minutes. If you have questions as we go, I encourage you to get on that Slido now so we can get through some questions toward the end. So let's start by thinking about what we mean by architecture, right? So let's think about a little bit what architecture actually is. Now, if somebody came up to you at the conference today and said, what does your architecture look like at your company? Now, in your head, you've probably got an idea. And maybe, in an ideal world, it looks like this sort of grand plaza where all your customers are having a great time and there's art on the ceilings. In reality, it's probably a little different, right? Reality is probably something a little more like this. There's some boxes and there's some lines that connect the boxes, and probably this was written up by one of your architects or one of your tech leads. Chances are it's probably out of date as well, right? So I want to talk less about the building of diagrams today and more about how we actually build architecture. And when I talk about building architecture for software, we need a little context, right? We have to talk a little bit about the organization that's building it and what it is that we're trying to do. So let's start there. My name is Mark Voelker, and I lead architecture for the Customer Identity Cloud at Okta, formerly known as Auth0. And what we do at the end of the day is that we are tasked with serving billions of logins per month to thousands of customers all over the world, and we're the front door to their applications. But it wouldn't be a very interesting talk if an architect got up here and told you about his day job, right? So we need to think a little bit about how that reflects on the rest of engineering as well. And for that reason, I brought Monica Bajaj with me, who's one of my closest partners in crime, to talk a little bit about what that looks like from her end.
Well, thank you, Mark. So I'm Monica Bajaj. I'm the Vice President of Engineering for Developer Experience for the Customer Identity Cloud on the Auth0 side for Okta. And my team, the goal of my team is to build a frictionless and a seamless developer experience right from onboarding to SDKs to extensibility and insights and marketplace, building the whole ecosystem so that developers can focus on their core mission and applications and the business logic and not worry about building identity solutions. And now I'm going to basically let Mark walk us through the architecture charter, and then I'll come back on the stage. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Monica. All right, so I said we need to set some context first. So let's talk a little bit about what we do and what forces are acting on us and what things we're contending with in thinking about how our architecture looks today and how it's going to look tomorrow. Auth0 was founded about 10 years ago now. So this is a product that's been around for a decade, which in software terms is kind of an eternity, right? A lot of software comes and goes in a few years. This one's been around for 10 years. And 2.5 years ago, we were acquired by Okta, right? So a whole new dimension to the business and a whole new set of customers. And we started 10 years ago working primarily with startups and small businesses. We still work with small businesses and startups, and we have a free tier that any of you can go play with today. But we also serve the Fortune 50. So things are changing, right? And we have thousands of developers that integrate us into their product and write code that runs in our platform. So we have to take somebody else's code and run it in our platform. Isn't that always fun? So it's an evolving business, right? We have sort of a general upmarket motion. We're processing now billions of logins per month. So it's not doubling small numbers anymore, but the numbers keep doubling, right? And there's a lot of change going on in this business as well. Gone are the days when username and password were sort of the keys to the kingdom, right? A lot of you in the audience started hearing about passkeys and about secondary forms of authentication that don't even involve a password anymore, right? And if you've attended our Octane conference here in San Francisco a few weeks ago, you probably heard a lot about that, because certainly a lot of our customers are asking for it. And on top of that, there's platform transformation, right? Auth0 and Okta work in the cloud, right? We're not an on-prem solution anymore. And that is by design. And when we talk about clouds, there's multiple clouds that we have to operate in, and multiple countries around the world that we have to operate in, and multiple sets of laws that we have to worry about complying with around the world, right? So these are all forces that are kind of evolving our business. Now, I put some corporate values on the slide here, and that's always a little dangerous at a no BS conference, right? But I think you're going to see a couple of these come out in how we build our architecture team. So I won't go through these individually, but keep those in mind as we go through the rest of the talk here. So next, let's talk about charter. We've got the context in mind, but why does an architecture team exist? Why have a chief architect who has a team of architects that reports to him and works across all the rest of engineering? Not all organizations do it that way, right? Sometimes architects are kind of scattered throughout different teams in engineering. Sometimes they report to a single senior executive. Sometimes they have very rigidly defined areas. You're the data architect, you're the platform architect, right? Well, we chose a little bit of a different path. But whatever path you choose and whatever team you have, they've probably got some reason to exist that way, right? So let's talk about our architecture charter. It's really simple. Just 2 sentences. And it's really simple to remember, a lot harder to implement, right? Level up the tech stack and level up the people stack. So that's kind of interesting because a lot of people come to me and say, Mark, you're a chief architect, you should be like a pure technologist, right? And that's not actually how we operate. These two are equal parts of our charter in the architecture team. So why? Why a dual-pronged charter? Well, let's start by breaking this charter down into its 2 constituent parts, right? So let's talk about the tech stack first. Now, at Okta, we're in the login business, and that means we are literally the front door to thousands of applications ranging from e-commerce sites to smart exercise equipment to medical records to government services. And if we're down, a lot of people are having a bad day, right? And that means we have to focus a lot on sort of big themes in our product, like scalability, like resilience, like efficiency. And on top of that, we're a SaaS provider. So that means we operate all that software that we build at scale across hundreds of environments all over the globe for a lot of different customers. So that puts some additional constraints on us, right? Hundreds of deployments, billions of logins, years of engineering. And at that scale, I would submit to you that you no longer have the luxury of thinking about any of those big themes in terms of their constituent parts. All right? So if we think about, say, for example, the resilience of a system like this. If you're in the SaaS business at scale, the resilience of your system is not the sum of the resiliencies of all those little pieces and parts, right? Your extra 9s of uptime actually live in the interactions between those components and the cascading effects that happen in the real world in distributed systems, right? And we could go on and on about this. If you think about the scalability of a system, if you want to squeeze extra requests per second out of the existing infrastructure that you have, you need to look at the interactions between the parts, not just the parts themselves. If you want to look at the efficiency of a system, you're going to find those extra COGS savings in those interactions, not just in the parts. So we could go on, but you kind of get the picture here, right? The components of a system interact, and those interactions are hugely important to architecture. Architecture is really the study of how components interact. Now, that brings us to the second part of the charter, because there's one component present in all the pieces of your service that you really can't forget about, and that is the people. Now, when I talk about the people, it's kind of interesting to think about deterministic systems, right? We think about software as you give it an input, it's going to give you the same output every time. This is the one part of your system where the output that you get from your engineers that are building, operating, and maintaining those services changes literally depending on what side of the bed they got up from in the morning and whether the coffee was strong enough. Why wouldn't an architect pay a lot of attention to that component that is the wild card in that system, right? And that is why we have that dual-pronged charter. Level up the tech stack and level up the people stack. So how do you know a successful architect? This is another thing that we do a little differently from some other organizations. I like to say that you'll know an architect because his sleeves are going to be rolled up and his hands are probably going to be dirty. Our architects work side by side with our engineering teams. They are not an ivory tower council that you have to go through on your way to production. It's not a checklist item. We actually have architects that are embedded with our teams on any project of reasonable size, right? And also consulting on all the small day-to-day things as well when somebody just needs a set of extra eyeballs, right? Now, as an architect myself, I can tell you that the most important thing for an architect, if he's trying to make a good decision, is context. Not just what decision are we trying to make today, but what does the system actually look like? How did we get to this point? Like, what happened in the past that got us to where we are today? What decisions were made? And where are we trying to go in the future? And who's actually building this thing and operating it, right? Because those are the human factors that are going to play in this, right? You can't ask a team to do something if they don't understand it, right? And you have to kind of know their capabilities and what they feel good about and what they feel bad about. So we find that the best way to get architects context is not to have a project where somebody comes and presents for 2 hours and goes through 40 slides, and you're expected to make a good decision on that. You get a lot more context if you're actually working hand in hand with those teams day to day. So the nuts and bolts of how we do it, I won't spend too much time on this, but I did want to kind of walk you through a few of the principles that we have for how we run architecture at Okta. First one is guardrails and handholds. So again, this is not a checklist item on your way to production where you have to come present to a council and then you get a thumbs up or thumbs down, right? We establish guardrails and handholds so that you can make a lot of those decisions yourself. For example, we have an engineering radar that tells us not only what technology we think is ready for production today, but also what we're moving away from and what we're experimenting with. And not just the technology, but also the principles and the practices that we use today, yesterday, and in the future. We also have an architecture roundtable, and that is literally that council of architects that I was just talking about. But in our case, it's actually not a decision-making body. So you don't come to us and get a thumbs up or thumbs down about whether your thing is ready for production, because hopefully, we've already got an architect embedded with you who's been prepping you for that for ages. So there's no real decision needed, right? We've already made that clear as we've worked on you with that project. What it actually is a way for us to bring together not only the architects, but also other people from around engineering and give you new perspectives, right? You may not realize how your thing impacts that other team. So an architect can help with that, but who better to have in the room than the other team, right? So we use this as a chance to level up our people stack as well. Now, we also run POCs and experiments to help people kind of provide some guardrails and handholds and kind of give them a safe environment to do those things. And most importantly, that leads us to writing it down. Now, when Monica gets back up here, she's going to have to show you the sleeve of her T-shirt, which I printed up for her, that actually has "Write it down" written on the sleeve, right? This is so ingrained in our culture because it is that important. It's a 10-year-old product built by engineers all over the world, many of whom are no longer with us, and we just hired a bunch of them too, right? So it is vitally important that we write down the decisions that got us to where we are today, so that people have that context that I just told you is gold, right, when they're trying to make decisions for the next one. So we do that in a lot of forms. We have RFCs and RFDs for sort of bigger projects, and we have what we call Rapid. It's a model from Bain Consulting for everyday decisions, right? But on top of that, we also do less formal writing. All my architects are tasked with writing down how they did things, how they approached things. Literally, they have to show their work, right? We have scratch pads that other teams can actually learn from and say, oh, I didn't realize that's how you go about troubleshooting, like, how do we get an extra 1,000 RPS out of this thing, right? If you don't know where to start, you start by looking at somebody else's work, right? Even if it didn't work, that at least tells you what path not to go down. We also have architects focus broadly on the bigger picture themes, right? Resilience, scale, cost, operability, pick your thing. These are the things that I want my team focused on, right? Because they see that, again, across the engineering organization. So they're not just looking at that one component. They're looking at all the components together and how they interact. And this is how we structure that team. So my team is the one in sort of the big, broad green block up top, right? Where we have architects that work across this organization. We rotate them around, embed them in different domains and different projects, right? And then on the bottom, we have what's called domain architects. Those folks actually don't report to me. They report directly to their domain leaders, like Monica, for example. And their job is to be very deep in the architecture of what they're doing in their domain, and then have a little bit of insight into the broader picture. And my team is kind of the flip of that, right? We look at the broader picture and have those domain architects to go to when we need the depth on that particular area. All right, so that's a little bit of nuts and bolts, but that all sounds kind of fluffy, and this is a no BS conference, right? So we thought the best way to bring this home and talk about how we actually do architecture at Okta is to look at a case study, like one of the projects that we actually did this past year. So for that, I'll bring up Monica to talk about how this looks from her end.
Thank you, Mark. So basically, let me set some context, as it is a no BS conference, so we have to do a real case study. At the Octane conference last month, we announced the rapid advancements in scalability, which we had to do this year. And it was needed in response to a customer demand. So we won't recap the whole story because it will take a lot of time, but we want to provide some context how our engineers and architects came together in a small amount of time and delivered this, and delivered like above and beyond. Because that's the story which me and Mark, it starts at me and Mark's level, and it goes all the way in multiple layers. So in February of 2023, our single subscriber, which was a private cloud offering, we offered 3 tiers. Basic was 100 RPS, performance tier was 500 RPS, and Performance Plus was 1,500 RPS. Over the next 3 months, course of 6 months actually, Okta delivered pretty much 6.5 times RPS. Our goal was to double, but we didn't stop. We were completely, we were unstoppable, and we kept going. So keep in mind, all this was delivered also maintaining the 4 nines SLAs. also making sure we are mindful of the cost as well, because things are not cheap, right? So it was really, really important to keep all of that. And most of you must be familiar that this was the year of efficiency, like cost, optimization. So all that was kept at the back of our mind in order to build all of this. So as you can see, 6.5 increase in 6 months. And there is much more to that story, which I will reveal later.
So we talked about how the architecture team is structured, and we talked about that two-pronged charter, right? And we're going to talk a little bit about this case study that Monica is going to walk us through. And let's start with the tech stack, right? Level up the tech stack is the first part of the charter. So this is an area of the code that's been around for a very long time, right? This is part of that 10-year code base that we've been talking about. And we knew that there's probably some skeletons in the closets. There's probably going to be some tribal knowledge that only a few people have, and others who are newer might not have all that context. Well, the first thing we had to recognize was our architect probably didn't have all that context either, because most of my team hasn't been around for 10 years either, right? And that's where we started with kind of those guardrails and handholds that we talked about earlier. We do have a set of principles. We do have a set of technologies. We do have a set of practices. And so we started by looking at how we'd apply those to this particular problem. How do we build that scale really, really quickly without sacrificing all the other things that we need to be mindful of, right? And then we had to look at it kind of pragmatically and figure out how to iterate through that process. And we had this guiding principle along the way that these were not 3 separate goals. Okay? So that's a really important one. Scale, resilience, cost efficiency are not 3 separate goals for us. As an architect looking at the whole system, at the end of the day, we're building one vehicle that's moving down the road. We're not building a single gear that moves really fast and is cheap, right? We have to look at the whole infrastructure. So we had to look at those not as 3 separate goals, not as 3 separate swim lanes, not as 3 separate tiger teams, but as one. So Monica, walk us through this. How did this look from your end?
Definitely. So as Mark mentioned, 3 goals put together in one goal, and that kept us grounded all the time throughout this process. So let me take you through a journey and talk about how we did this in partnership with our architects. The first question is always, for me as an engineering leader, is like, where do I even start getting engaged with the architects? As engineering leaders, I'm sure all of us have gone through this in our journey. We are enticed to start writing our code, write as a fresh code, not work, and we always try to find faults in other people's code. But the reality is, the most challenging stuff is, how do you improve the existing code? Because that code has stood for a long time. So it's really, really important to think that way. And it's a good problem to have, which means that software stood for stability and the test of the time as well. Now, majority of us in the audience always have a challenge of picking 2 out of 3, whether it is cost, like quality, scope, and time, right? You have to pick 2 many times. Similarly, scale, resiliency, and cost efficiency. No, we did not. We picked all 3. And you picked 3 was the message that we have to go through this journey across the plan. And so how did we do it? When we picked these 3 problems, scale, resiliency, and cost efficiency, we also added one more element, which was optimizing on time. Because time was very critical, and still we have to meet all the 3 demands of these goals. So instead of looking to get this as individual swim lanes, we looked at it in the form of a Venn diagram. And this is very useful lens when you start building any scaled architecture and understand why this needs to be looked with a Venn diagram lens, so that we could execute what Okta needs, which is in the center. So here is our extensibility platform. As you can see, identity for one customer is not the same as other customer. That's why we provide these extensibility points within the authentication flow. And the whole purpose is developers can insert their customized JavaScript code in those extensibility points, and to make the authentication flow meet the needs what they want. And obviously, every interaction which happens through the extensibility point is run by an runtime engine. You can consider it like extensibility engine. We have our own proprietary name as well. and you will see that. It's called as web task in the diagrams. But think about it as an extensibility engine, which is the back end, which is going to fuel these extensibility points. Now, our challenge was to scale the extensibility platform, which means design for 10x, but build for 3x. So we went with that mindset to begin with. So as you can see, here is a simplified architecture. It's a public, on our public cloud environment, bunch of EC2 instances. There are containers, and then running as I said, hundreds of Docker containers. And each container is associated with a tenant, which is called as a customer. Now, each instance also has an engine proxy here, whose job is completely to maintain the life of these containers and also route to the right tenant to the right container. We are using a round-robin algorithm here. And you can see from the diagram that it is meeting the scale. I mean, it's meeting the resiliency because we have a replica, but there's a duplication, right? And the system cannot scale horizontally, and it starts becoming really expensive. So we added a new component, which is a web task router, which is sitting right in front of the load balancer. And what it does is it keeps a tally of all the tenants, which tenants goes to which instance, so no duplication of tenants is happening. But what happened here? We have the scale, we have the cost efficiency taken care. But what if web task router goes down? The whole system is down. So the resiliency part is gone again. So now, what did we do? So we created one more replica of web task router, but the challenge here is that each router will now have its own tally, which means that it can lead to the duplication again. So for example, you can see the green router tenant 1 to instance B, and then the orange router to instance A for the same tenant. So again, there is a duplication. We fix the resiliency, but as we scale, it impacts the cost again. So we are constantly playing with this. So we added another component that holds the state, routing state of all the engine router and have one view, which is the in-memory DB. The challenge is this does solve the cost problem, resiliency problem. However, what happens is it adds delay when it comes to scale. Basically, syncing the state can get slow. So going back to our original goal was very simple. One tenant gets routed to one container and one instance, irrespective of the scale. That was a very simple goal. So now what we did was we introduced the concept of consistent hashing to get this solution to much simpler and elegant state. And I would not go into the detail of consistent hashing because we are running out of time for a few other topics here. But the fun was not yet over. Our goal for the scale was to double from 1,500 to 3,000 RPS. We kept doubling it. It became 6.5x times. And now, as of today, we are supporting 20K RPS. So we are continuously on this journey to make scale better. So I walked you through a real case study here, as you can see. Here with the actual 3 elements, the scale, the resiliency, and the cost efficiency. But throughout this journey, as Mark mentioned earlier, leveling up the tech stack and leveling up people's stack was always in mind for all of us. And so I'm going to share how, as a product owner lens, views level up tech stack. So first one is communication. The architecture roundtable, which Mark mentioned, is very important. Rolling the sleeves by architects and domain architects and leads is really important. And we formed a small team which works closely, documents everything. And it's important that the collaboration also happens. So when collaboration happens, it's always important that all hands on deck are there. It's a multifunctional team, right, from tech lead to quality to SRE. Then the consensus is there. Consensus is very important, and it's not like top-down, but meet the team where they are. So that's really important. Shared goals is really important because architects continue to look at the big puzzle, and as a domain leader, my team, my architects are the small piece of the puzzle. And we have to carve that to make a balanced portfolio. And writing it down is really important because our teams are distributed.
Yeah, it's a good point, writing it down, right? Like
Yep.
all those iterations we went through, those all got written up. right, as we went along through. And we didn't have to solve the problem all in one go, right? We just had to keep iterating. So Monica, if you can click for me there, we talked about the tech stack side of the things. Let's talk a little bit about the people stack as well, right? And iteration is one of those key values that we just talked about and showing our work, right? Now, we also did a little bit of mentoring in this case as well, with motorcycles, apparently. So Monica, why don't you lead us through a little bit about how we did on the people stack?
So from a product owner lens, when it comes to people stack, scaling the talent is really, really important. By leading these cross-collaboration efforts across the board on large technical initiatives, it is really important that my engineers continue to learn new technologies, new best practices, and architecture principles. Career progression is equally important because I want them to look and understand what does a day of an architect looks like. And that can happen only when they spend time. Long-term vision. Architects are constantly looking at long-term vision in terms of making sure what's the company's long-term strategy, and it can help my tech leads and engineers to connect the dots between what they are seeing versus what they can bring to the products. Recognition and advocacy is another important part. When the new initiative comes, because architects know the engineers very well, it is very important that they can recommend who will be the right fit with the right skill set. And then ship faster. More hands, more heads come together, and we are able to ship things faster. Now, from my perspective, it is very important that as a VP of engineering, I always look about investing in my people and what are the long-term outcomes I look forward, and when I sit down with Mark and discuss about, hey, what are the long-term outcomes with this partnership, what we have? So number one is technical excellence. Having architects embedded in the domain strengthens the posture of the entire partnership. Scaling architecture thinking, scaling the people, and seeing that outcome is an entire technology roadmap, because we build product roadmap, but we have to constantly build technology roadmap in parallel as well. Innovation and adaptability is really important. As we heard in many talks, like we are constantly pivoting. So how do we make sure that we keep up with the innovation and still make our teams very adaptable to these changes? Proactive risk mitigation. Now that architects and engineers are sitting together, they are constantly thinking with the same lens, like what can go wrong? Like challenging each other is really, really important because a lot of great outcomes comes there. And then the talent succession. We are building a next generation of architects. So tomorrow, if anybody in my team wants to be an architect, it's a much easier path for me to have that discussion with Mark.
All right, so I talked about how this is a little bit unique compared to some of the other companies that I've worked at in the past. And for context, I was at VMware for a long time and Cisco for a long time before that. So pretty different organizations, right? But I did want to highlight that we're not the only ones that are thinking about it this way, right? After we kind of built this organization, we actually ran into some great writings from Andrew Harmel Law from ThoughtWorks. So if you're interested in finding out a little bit of a different perspective that's along similar lines, I encourage you to take a look at a few of these. And Monica, why don't you bring us home? So summing it all up, how do we do architecture at Okta, right? First and most important is level up the tech stack, level up the people stack. We consider the human beings an integral part of the system that we are building, right? And that is super important to us. Not only the ones that are there today, but also the ones that are building and operating it yesterday, today, and tomorrow.
And we do architecture very collaboratively with a focus on providing handholds and guardrails, rather than making it very hard and fast rules.
And that system of guardrails and handholds also means that our architecture practice is a really collaborative one, right? We want our architects to be very familiar not only with the software, but with the teams that are building it. Context is the single most important factor for making good architecture decisions for us.
And because context is gold and collaboration is imperative, it's very, very important that you do write it down. And I'm going to share something here. Is like we have a T-shirt called Better Together and Write It Down as a part of our mission.
I promised she'd model the T-shirt, right? So finally, we see architecture as a team sport, right? We talked about how we embed our architects with the rest of our teams, and that win really comes when architects are playing right alongside with those service owners. I like to say that our favorite style of T-shirts for architects are ones where you can roll up the sleeves, right? So with that, I think we've maybe got a couple minutes for a couple questions.
Thank you both. That was awesome. I really love how this is all about teamwork, and here you are co-presenting. That's amazing. Hopefully you get along just as well in your day job. Okay, so we're short on time, but we may have maybe a few minutes for a couple questions. So first question, what measures have you taken to ensure that architectural decisions align with the overall business strategy and objectives?
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. So for us, we're actually right in the thick of our fiscal year planning for next year right now. That's literally the thing I have to go do when I get done at the conference today. So we're starting that process not with just the architecture team, but with actually the business side of the house, right? So we look at those themes that are going to be consistent from year to year, like resiliency, like scale, like efficiency, all those kind of things, in the context of the things that we're trying to build for the next coming year, right? So there's always a healthy give and take there.
Awesome, okay. Here's a similar question, maybe a little different. How do you balance innovation and architectural consistency?
Yeah, so the Tech Radar is actually a really good example of that, right? It's a set of principles, technologies, and practices that we use not only today, but things that we're experimenting with. Things that we're kind of giving people, hey, if you want to go experiment with something, try this other database, because we're kind of playing around with it, and we think it might be a good fit for a few things, right? But that also doesn't give them an unlimited palette, right, where they can just go pick anything out there. And that's what kind of helps us keep the guardrails together, right, to keep the architecture from going all kinds of different ways.
And that's where the domain architects also recommend, because they are closer to the product, while architects are, Mark's team is very close to the overall long-term vision. So,
very nice. Yep. Let's do this one. What role does feedback play in fine-tuning Okta's architectural governance and ensure its effectiveness?
I can take that one.
Go for it.
Actually, as a part of the architecture roundtable, which really helps, where tech leads and some of the principal engineers sit in those meetings, and they bring in the perspective from a domain and business knowledge, where architects bring in design principles and best architecture standard practices, and that's where they come together, and the whole feedback loops, they come back to the teams, share that information, go back to those architecture roundtables, and share their experiences.
Yeah, I think it's really important to emphasize as well, it's not even just the architecture roundtables, right? That's one formal forum. But the whole point here is that we're embedded with those teams, right? So that feedback comes day to day in Slack conversations, right? And meetings that we're in staff meetings with those guys.
Yeah, and it comes every day. It's not like, we do like every quarter or so, but it comes every day, the feedback loop.
It's amazing.
Yep.
All right, I think that's all we have time for, but just my one last question.
Yes.
I'll ask each of you, what do you enjoy so much that it makes you completely lose track of time?
Spending time with engineers and architects.
What?
Good answer.
That is
I
true.
like that.
Actually, that is true.
Then you're in the right position.
Yes.
How about you, Mark?
For me, as an architect, I'm always looking for balance, right? So for me, the thing is to go out in the real world after I spend all day typing away at code that doesn't have a tangible form. I love to go out and do things that actually get my hands dirty. So I go build something in the woodworking shop, or I go for a hike.
But jokes aside, like I lose time when I'm in the woods.
In
that
the
was
what?
a joke?
Yeah, in the woods.
In the woods. Yeah.
So
Okay.
I like to do like a lot of. Mark is also a scout parent, and I'm a scout mom.
Oh, nice.
So we have like a lot of things to talk about in common when we do hiking and when we are out.
That's awesome.
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you both coming here and sharing your insights. It was amazing.
Thank you.